Now, the combination of Russian meddling in social media and the effect on the 2016 election. Nick Schifrin reports on how they became a combustible mix.
Judy, thank you. Last year, the U.S. intelligence community concluded that in 2016, Russia launched a campaign of disinformation to discredit Hillary Clinton and help elect Donald Trump. One of the sharpest analysts of Russia's so-called active measures is former U.S. government intelligence analyst Clint Watts, who almost 1 year ago testified before the Senate Intelligence Committee.
Part of the reason active measures have worked in this U.S. election is because the commander-in-chief has used Russian active measures at times against his opponents. But until we get a firm basis on fact and fiction in our own country, get some agreement about the facts, whether it be do I support the intelligence community or a story I read on my Twitter feed, we're going to have a big problem.
That problem continues today, and Watts has advised the Senate Intelligence Committee on its investigation into Russian meddling. He's also written a new book, Messing with the Enemy: Surviving in a Social Media World of Hackers, Terrorists, Russians, and Fake News. And Clint Watts joins me here in the studio.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks very much. I want to get today in a second, but let's go back to 2014. You're investigating terrorists. In fact, you're actually talking to some terrorists, and that's when you first encounter Russian trolls. Tell us about that.
Yeah, Russian trolls were different from normal trolls. I think everybody gets trolls if you're on social media, but they tend to not stick around forever. They are motivated usually whenever you're talking, but this was continuous. And when you looked at the accounts, they were sharing basically the same message. They would share the same content or links. And they also looked to be almost uniformly spread around the world, and they would talk all hours of the night. And so it was the first time I saw this sort of sustained and persistent campaign that it looked much larger, but when you really got to the core of it was just a few small actors. And that's what I knew I was onto something very different from the terrorism sort of field that I've been looking at before.
And fast forward to 2016, Russia launched what you call the most sophisticated hacking campaign in world history, but they weren't hacking only our computers. They were hacking, you write, our minds. What do you mean?
They were hacking to gain compromising information on targets so they could dump that out into the open and then use that in social media to influence people towards a particular policy position. This is very different. It was a lot of different targets in the US and in the EU. It was political parties, media personalities, anyone that was an opponent of Russia. And it was such a wide scale that it gave them really the ammunition, the nuclear fuel to power those narratives going into 2016.
You think that it was successful. And in fact, you specifically write that Russia helped give Trump Michigan and Wisconsin, and therefore the presidency. What's your proof of that?
Just from my analysis of watching it and looking at the votes. Essentially, those were the two closest contests in the United States. Those two states were states that Russia may very well have won because of several different factors. One, Bernie Sanders performed better than Hillary Clinton during the primaries in those two states, which was a surprise. The narrative that Bernie Sanders got a raw deal from the DNC came 100% from a Russian action. They stole the DNC's records, they leaked that out there, and they powered that narrative. The other thing that we need to look at is those are two Democratic states that have really turned towards a pro-Trump narrative. And even in the case of Jill Stein, you saw a lot of people show up to vote there. So in a very close contest, the Russians can actually tip a state or two very easily because the margin is only 1% on any given election day.
Do you think the Russians will try it again this year?
No, I don't think they have anything they really want, beyond sustaining audience and sustaining influence. The one thing we should know is Russia never got in the game to win one election or, put one candidate forward. The idea was to undermine democracy, to make Americans lose confidence in democratic institutions and elected officials by turning every crack in our country into a chasm and pitting different race, ethnic groups, religious groups, social economic groups, Second Amendment abortion rights, whatever it might be, where we fight against each other instead of being a unified front against them.
And that's one of the most important conclusions. You write that not only is there a threat to democracy outside, but it actually comes from inside. The threat is from America itself. So how should America protect itself not only from Russia or any outside influence, but also, I think, what you call narrow-mindedness?
Yeah, the biggest challenge we face moving forward isn't the Russians. It's really other Americans who see this technique and see the political gain that can come from it and adopt it on their own, meaning they come up with their own news outlets, which maybe aren't telling the truth, but tell a truth that's preferred. We start looking for alternative facts. We have to have a baseline of fact and fiction in this country, or you can't have political debate. We can't go to Congress and have good policies because we don't even agree on what's actually happening in the real world. The reason social media influence works is because of bias. One, we go to social media for confirmation bias. We want to read things that confirm what we already believe. The second part is implicit bias. We like getting information from people that look like and talk like us. The Russians understood this very well. Tell people what they want to hear and look like them, and they were more likely to take it whether it's true or not. So a way to get around that is to help the consumer, rather than trying to have the government regulate everything, or even have social media companies trying to determine what is good news or bad news, is to create an independent rating agency that rates on two sort of axes. The first one is fact versus fiction. What is a rating period? How do they perform over time? And the other one is opinion versus reporting. It's very hard on social media to know, is this an opinion article that I'm receiving, or is this actually a reported article?
And lastly, a lot of people fall for fake news, including you. You admitted it, that you fell for fake news. Can you tell us the story about your daughter?
Yeah, I had a daughter who was severely autistic. When she was a small kid, the big theory then was if you have too many shots, or too many shots in a row or all on the same day, your child will get autism. And so I actually worked to space out my daughter's shots to make sure that she would not get autism. Now, going into all the research now, that's been completely debunked. But I wanted to believe, that's my confirmation bias. I wanted to believe I could protect her. Implicit bias, I was talking to my friends who were also concerned about this, so I started to invest in it. And I chose news and information and outlets that were conspiracies, that weren't actually true. They weren't well vetted. And so I think it's important for everyone to just admit that anyone can fall for false information, not to take it personal and try and double down and prove that you're right, but be open to the fact that, yeah, anyone can be duped, and try and do better next time.
Clint Watts, thank you very much.
Thank you.